I'm a 3D artist and I'm going to show you my entire CG workflow for creating bottle renders. By the end of this video, I will have shown you how to create this scene here. This is the same process I use for client projects such as this, and this. For every 10 comments on this video, I will give away the project file to someone. It all starts off with a blank project. Straight away I dive into the front view where I'll use a reference image of the bottle we're trying to make. You can do this by pressing the middle mouse button or pressing this icon in the top right corner. Once you're here, press Shift V to bring up your viewport settings. Then move to the tab titled Back where we can load in a reference image. I got this image from a website called Saverglass where you can browse through tons of different bottles and download spec sheets with dimensions. The bottle we're trying to make for this project is cylindrical, so guess what? We're starting with a cylinder. Let's change the height of the cylinder to 24 centimeters to match the spec sheet. We now need to scale down the ref image to match the size of our weirdly shaped cylinder. Press Shift V to bring back up our viewport settings. Let's increase the transparency so we can see our cylinder better and then decrease the size of the image. Once we get the scale of the image to match the height of the cylinder, I can then decrease the radius of the cylinder to match the image. You can do this by pressing the little dot on the top right corner of the cylinder and dragging it inwards. We then want this reference to line up with the cylinder, so I use the offset settings to move it into place. I like to have my object sitting on the base of the workplace, so we can do that by taking half the height of the cylinder and inputting that into the Y position. We then press Shift V again and use the offset value to line the reference image up. Next port of call, saving the file. You don't want to lose all the hard work we've done so far. I'm going to create a backup of this original shape just in case we need it for any reason in the future. Okay, let's get stuck into modeling. First, press C on the keyboard to make our cylinder editable, which will allow us to manipulate polygons, points and edges. We don't need the top cap of our cylinder, so let's go to polygon mode, press UL for loop selection and delete this top cap. Let's subdivide this object to smooth it out. Hold Alt or Command on a Mac and select the subdivision surface object to automatically apply it as a parent. Let's switch to edge mode, which will allow us to move the edges around and create loop cuts. Let's press UL again on the keyboard so that we can select these lines and move them around the object. Let's grab the rectangle selection tool and make a selection of the top section in order to scale it down. But before we do that, we're actually going to use our first modeling tool. Right click and select loop/path cut. We can now left click to create additional cuts in our geometry. This is how we will build the shape for our bottle. Let's press T on the keyboard for our scale tool, or you can select this icon on the left hand side. We don't want this to scale on the Y axis, so let's come up to the top left and lock our Y axis and then start to scale down. You can see how this is starting to shape the bottle, and this is the process we'll use throughout. Let's make another loop cut and press the 3 horizontal lines at the top to center it. Again, press UL for loop selection and then T for scale, and let's scale this up. We'll continue to repeat this process throughout. Loop cut, loop selection, scale. Loop cut, loop selection, scale, in order to build a shape which resembles our reference. Let's enable our subdivision so we can see how the bottle looks when it's smoothed out. This is looking good, so let's continue to add loop cuts and scale whilst in this mode to get a better view on how our bottle is looking. Whilst in loop mode, we can hold Shift while selecting edges to select more than one. We can then move them up and down. Just make sure you don't move them on the Z axis. I'll continue to repeat this process, adding loop cuts and scaling to match the profile of the bottle and then enabling subdivision to see the smoothed out version. If you want to add more than one loop cut and distribute them evenly, create a cut, press the 3 horizontal lines and then press the plus and minus button to either add or subtract from the amount of cuts. Let's jump out of the front view and into the perspective view to look at the base of the bottle. Let's start by getting that pesky grid out of the way. Go to Filter, Work Plane to disable it. I tend to create a loop cut near the bottom of the bottle and then one underneath to get a nice rounded edge. It's then just a case of moving these around until you get a nice rounded edge which matches the reference. I added a couple more loop cuts in the center of the bottle just to ensure the body doesn't taper off towards the bottom. We want to try create an even topology, so let's add a few more final loop cuts to the body so that they're evenly spaced throughout. This is coming together nicely. Let's revisit this base again, and we need to add a few more edge cuts to get this rounding to look right. From looking at some references of bottles, they tend to have a line near the bottom where it rounds off, so I've recreated that by adding additional cuts very close to each other. We can see the pinching in the object where we have created that line. Subtle details like this will just help to add that additional realism when it comes to rendering later on. The final detail of this model is the punt at the bottom. Yes, P-U-N-T. This is where it dips up inside the bottle. Let's go into polygon mode and press UL to select the innermost set of polygons on the bottom. We'll then press E for the move tool and move these polygons up. We can then press T for scale and scale this so we match the shape of the reference. Let's enable our subdivision surface again to see how it looks, and it looks like we need some additional cuts in order to match it up to the reference. You can fiddle with this for as long as you like, and I decided to add a few more cuts just to match it up as close as possible to the reference image. I think by now, hopefully you guys understand the workflow. Just create your line cuts, scale them apart appropriately to smooth them out how much you'd like, and then add your subdivision surface to preview it rounded out. This looks pretty good to me, and I think with a few more final changes to the bottle, we're pretty much bang on to the reference image that we started with, and we can now move on to the next step. Before we start working into the details of this, I like to create a basic lighting setup in order to check everything looks okay. Let's create a redshift camera and set the focal length to 80mm to make it feel more graphical. I then move the camera around using the 4 different views until we center the bottle into the middle of our frame. Let's add a dome light and search for a suitable HDRI. I'm using one from Polyhaven and it's a Studio HDRI. You should definitely check out their website. My go-to is the Studio Small 05. With the introduction of Aces as the default color space, it's essential that we assign our colors with the proper color space. For HDRIs, let's set it to working space linear rec 709 sRGB. This will just ensure that we get more accurate colors. Let's disable the background and remove the saturation. Let's press R for the rotate tool and start to rotate this around to check out the different lighting. We're looking out for any areas in the model where it doesn't quite look right. For example, this line at the bottom looks too harsh. If we increase our image resolution, we'll be able to zoom in more into our image and just look closer at this detail. Let's change our render view mode to original size, which will now display at the resolution we just set. Now we can zoom in closer on our object. To see our render better in the viewport, let's disable materials and set it to quick shading. The rest of the model looks good to me, so let's just fix that line at the bottom. If we move the lines apart ever so slightly, this will help to reduce the pinching of that line and just soften it ever so slightly while still retaining that detail. One last check, and I think everything is looking good to me. We'll add a few more line cuts just to even out the topology, and now we're ready to move on to the next step. In order for this bottle to calculate the reflections and refractions properly, we need to add thickness. We'll quickly create a backup of this model just in case we need it at any point in the future. Let's take our model out of the subdivision surface and duplicate this by Ctrl and dragging the layer. Let's go into polygon mode and select all by pressing Ctrl A. There's a couple methods of creating this thickness, but we're going to use a tool called the normal move. This will allow us to scale our polygons based on their normals. Just right click, scroll down and select normal move, and now we can click and drag to move our object inwards. A move value of -0.25 looks about right, but it's worth experimenting with this to see what different results you can get. The only issue with normal move is that it will sometimes collapse polygons in on themselves, so let's go into edge mode and fix some of these. You may notice when you zoom in you get some clipping. You can fix this by pressing Ctrl D to bring up your project settings and then changing the view clipping to small. Okay, let's press UL for loop selection and start to reposition these edges which are messed up. You can then go in and scale up and down and reposition the edges throughout the rest of the bottle to try keep the thickness consistent throughout, although it can help with realism to add some variation. This all looks good to me, so let's rename this layer to keep things nice and organized. We'll also control and drag this layer just to create a duplicate, as we'll use this for the liquid later. In order for refractions to be calculated properly when we connect these two objects, we need our normals to be facing outwards. So let's go to polygon mode, select all, and then right click and reverse normals. We need to connect both of these objects, so let's select both of the layers, right click and select connect objects and delete. We now need to fill this hole at the top, and luckily this can be done pretty easily using a tool called the bridge. Go to edge mode and then right click and select the bridge tool. Now we can just click and drag to connect one edge to another, and we're going to do this for the whole top of this glass bottle. It can be easily done to accidentally connect the edges you don't want to, so just have Ctrl Z on standby. Let's hit Ctrl A to check our normals. They're all orange, which means they're facing outwards, which means we're good to keep going. Let's add a subdivision surface just to check how this is looking, and it's looking pretty good to me, but I do just want to make some adjustments to the lid. I'm going to go back into edge mode and just start to move around some of these different edges just to smooth things out. We can remove unwanted edge cuts by using loop selection mode, right clicking and pressing dissolve. This is feeling much better, and I'm just going to make some final adjustments to the lid, and then we're ready to move on to the next step, which is making the liquid. Let's just quickly keep things organized and rename our layers. Let's take the inner wall we saved from earlier, and we're going to use this for the base shape of our liquid. In order for liquid to calculate properly, it needs to intersect the inner wall ever so slightly. We can do this by using the normal move tool from earlier to scale this up ever so slightly. We'll then grab the rectangle selection tool, go to edge mode and delete the top portion. When it comes to the bottom of the liquid, I actually find that not intersecting it with the bottle gives you more realistic results, and despite it not being technically correct, I do think it looks better in the end. To do this, let's go to polygon mode and loop selection and select the polygons on the bottom, and then just move them ever so slightly upwards so that they're back inside the bottle. Let's quickly create a subdivision surface for our liquid and preview the wireframe for both of these objects. This looks pretty good to me, and as we can see, the liquid intersects slightly apart from at the bottom where it overlaps and returns back inside the bottle. Again, for refractions to be calculated properly, we need to close the hole at the top of the liquid. We can do this while right clicking whilst in polygon mode and selecting close polygon hole. Let's select this new face and use the inset tool to extrude this inwards and create some topology. We want this to have quad topology, so let's zoom in and fix the topology at the center. This time we're going to use the line cut tool and cut lines in order to create quad based polygons. You can follow my approach here by cutting 3 times vertically and 3 times horizontally until you're left with this grid shape. This is looking much better, but our liquid is too rounded on the edge, so let's add some additional loop cuts. Finally, to simulate surface tension, we need to edit our liquid so it curves towards the edge of the bottle. To do this, let's move the outermost edge upwards, and we may also have to rejig some of the other edge cuts to sharpen this edge even more. I decided to dissolve some of the edges to make the curve smoother and then go into polygon mode and select the innermost polygons and move them down slightly to make the curve more prominent. The reason for creating this surface tension is that when it comes to rendering, this will give the liquid line some thickness, which will help to increase the realism. I almost forgot, let's convert the bottom of the liquid and the bottle walls to have quad topology as well. For this we'll follow the same method as we did for the liquid, using the line cut tool. In this case we need to remove the polygons, so let's right click and press mount, and now we can add our own line cuts using the line cut tool. I'll then repeat the same process for the outer and inner wall of our bottle. This time however we need to make a loop cut first, mount it, and then create the line cuts. Having a quad based topology like this will optimize our model for subdividing and also for UV unwrapping. And that is the liquid ready to go. So the final part of the modeling is to do the lid. Unfortunately we don't have a reference for this, so I just did it by eye, and I've also sped it up since we're using pretty much the same techniques that we've covered so far in this video. But if you do want to go through, you can slow this video down and just watch it step by step, but it really is pretty simple. Before we move on to modeling the label, let's actually get rid of these subdivision surfaces and start using the redshift object tag. Just right click on one of our models, go to redshift tags and redshift object, and then go to the geometry tab and enable tessellation. This will subdivide our object whilst keeping it low poly in our viewport. We can then control drag our redshift object tag to the rest of the models, and just like that we have a lovely subdivided model whilst keeping it low poly. Okay, on to modeling the label. There's quite a few different approaches depending on the type of label you're trying to produce. For this project I used a plane and a bend deformer to wrap it around the object, whereas on this one I actually made the label within the same glass material. If you want to know more about that, check out my video about how to texture a wine bottle. We're actually going to use a different technique for this project. We're going to select a bunch of polygons and then split these to give us the shape for our label. Let's duplicate this label and subdivide it with a subdivision level of 3, and then right click, select children and connect objects and delete. We'll then right click and select split, which will split this polygon selection to a new layer, and we can delete the original layer. Let's add some thickness to our label. Press Shift C to bring up our search menu and hold Alt whilst you select cloth surface to make it a parent. We'll then reduce this subdivision to 0 and add a thickness of 0.01. I decided to shrink the size of the label slightly, so using loop selection mode I selected the outer ring of polygons and then just hit delete. And just like that we have modelled our label, but more importantly our bottle. Now it's time for everyone's favourite part of the process, UV unwrapping. UV unwrapping is the process of creating a flat surface from our 3D model so that we can easily apply textures. Let's start with a label. We'll select our object and go up to the top right and switch to our UV edit layout. This object only has one side to it, so all we have to do is press UV unwrap. If we go up to textures and select UV map, we can preview this with a coloured checkerboard to ensure the map isn't stretched. This looks good to me, so let's save this out. In the UV editor window, go to File, New Texture, then we can name our UV texture and choose our wanted resolution. Let's name this bottle label UV and set the resolution to 4K. Let's increase the bits per channel to 16-bit, which will help us with texturing down the line. Then we need to go to Layer, Create UV Mesh. Finally, let's go to File, Save Texture As, change this to PSD and hit OK. Then save your file in the appropriate folder and we're all done and dusted for the label. For the rest of the model, which is slightly more complex, I like to use a different software called Rhizome UV. Rhizome UV is a software which solely focuses on UV unwrapping models, and I find it much easier and quicker than Cinema's tools. Luckily there is a bridge plugin so you can export your model straight from Cinema 4D to Rhizome. So let's select the bottle and get straight into it. Rhizome will try to UV unwrap your model for you, but I want to start from scratch. So let's go to File, Reload. Now we have our model which we can begin to UV unwrap. Let's start by going to edge mode and making some cuts on our object. We can double click to make a loop selection of our object, and if we hold Control we can continue to make multiple selections. Let's start by making 2 selections on our lid and then work our way down to the bottom of the bottle. Whilst continuing to hold Control, let's make a selection towards the base here, and then let's move inside and do the same on the inside. Then let's make a cut down the side which will allow us to lay the body of the bottle flat. Again, let's do the same for the inside. Now if we hit C on the keyboard, we can turn those selections into cuts. Our lines should turn orange to signal this. We're ready to unwrap. Press Ctrl A and go into polygon mode, and then press the U logo at the top of your viewport to unwrap our object. And just like that, we have great looking UVs already. Let's create a separate UV for the neck, so we'll go to edge mode and create a cut around the top and bottom of the neck. There's a great tool in Ryzen for straightening our UVs out. Let's do this for the neck and the body. First, let's go to island mode and then select the UV map for our neck. We can then go up to the align menu in the top right and select this icon here to convert the UV map to a rectangle. This makes it much easier to work when it comes to texturing. Let's repeat this for the body of the bottle as well. Finally, let's press this icon at the top to arrange all our UVs. If you decide you want to undo a cut, you can select the edges you want and then go up and press the weld tool in the top left. You then need to unwrap your model again, and if you want to preserve the location of the rest of the maps, just select the island you want to update and press unwrap. I decided to readjust some cuts at the top of the bottle as well as cutting edges inside, which I forgot to do earlier. These are just a duplicate of the ones outside. If you want to check the orientation of your UVs and make sure they aren't stretching, you can press this checkerboard icon here. As we can see, the UVs of our body are upside down, so let's use the align menu to flip these. We'll then reorganize the layout again. Finally, I decided to move the cut closer to the bottom so we have more room on the body of the bottle for details, which we will look at later. Because we've made an adjustment, we need to update this island one last time, and let's press the layout icon to optimize the map. And just like that, we have a lovely UV unwrapped bottle. Because we use the bridge to open Ryzen, all we have to do is press Ctrl S to save, and we'll be brought back to Cinema with our updated model and UVs. Now we need to go to UV edit mode so we can save these UVs, and this is the same process as last time, so go to File, New Texture, Layer, Create UV Mesh, and finally File, Save Texture. I then repeated the same process for the lid, which I will quickly speed up as it follows the exact same techniques we've just used. Now it's on to the fun part of the process, which is texturing, where we can finally dial in the detail for our models. Let's start with the label. We'll open up the Photoshop file we made using the UVs from earlier. I have a label here which I prepared for this tutorial using Adobe Illustrator. Let's select the label and press Ctrl C to copy it, and then go to Photoshop and press Ctrl V to paste it. In the 2022 version of Photoshop, we have the option to paste as layers, which is the method that we'll use. Let's create an alpha mask from the label design by creating a black background and converting the design to white. Let's export this as a PNG so we can bring it into Cinema. Now we'll create a bump map so that we can create embossed text in Cinema 4D. I start by converting the layers to smart objects, which will allow us to apply smart filters while keeping it non-destructive. Let's use the Gaussian blur effect to soften the text layers, which will give us a soft embossed feel in Cinema. We can then dial in a blur amount which we think is appropriate. Just keep in mind the more you blur it, the softer the embossing will be in Cinema. I like to find a value which gives the text a soft edge without completely blurring the whole text layer. The beauty of using smart objects is that we can tweak the smart filters, but we can always go back to the original version we had. Okay, let's save this one out as a PNG as well, and we'll call this one bump. Okay, let's dive back into Cinema and create a new redshift material and load in our new label texture. I have a shortcut set up to load mine in, but you can press Shift C to bring up your node menu and then type in texture node and grab a texture that way. Before we link this up, let's make a gold material for our label. Let's go to the preset menu and select gold. Let's change the Fresnel type to IOR Advanced, which I find gives us a nicer looking gold color. Let's press Shift C to bring up our node menu and grab a material blender node, which we'll use to blend between the gold label material and the label design we made. Plug our gold material node into the base color of our material blender and then plug this into the output surface. Let's grab another material node and change the diffuse color to black. I always tried not to go all the way to 0% as nothing in real life is fully black. We'll then link this into layer color 1 of our material blender. To transition between these two materials, we'll use the label design alpha we made earlier. Redshift uses aces as its default color space, so we need to assign the color space of our textures appropriately. For black and white images, we need to set it to raw. Now let's plug this into blend color 1 of our material blender and preview this in the render view. Let's rotate the dome light to get a better view of the label. Let's increase the reflection roughness because the gold material is slightly too glossy right now. This looks much better already. Let's duplicate our texture node by holding Ctrl and dragging, and we'll update this with our bump map texture. Press Ctrl C to bring up our node menu, and let's grab a bump map node. We'll plug our texture into the input of the bump map and then the bump map into the bump input of our material node. We'll add a little bit of roughness to our text layer just so it smooths out the reflections. Let's create a close-up camera, so we'll duplicate our current one by control dragging, and then we'll move it around using the icons in the top right. Let's zoom in closer on the bottle, and if we select our camera, we can use the rotation parameters to tilt our camera. Let's hit play on our Redshift render view and see how it's looking. We'll then rotate our HDRI around so that we can see how the label reacts to the light. I think we need to reduce the bump amount as it's too intense right now. Let's rotate the HDRI again and this time see how it reacts to the light. It looks pretty good to me. If you wanted, you could invert the bump amount to make it a deboss instead of an emboss. Let's make this gold label feel more realistic by breaking it up with some speckles, which we'll do using an image texture. Let's go to a site called cciotextures.com and search for a paper texture. This site is great because everything is in the public domain, so you can use these textures however you'd like, whether that's for personal or commercial work. I'm going to download Paper 02, which we will use for the bump and reflection roughness of our gold material. Let's drag the normal map into Cinema 4D. Let's set the color space to raw and then plug this into the bump map. We'll also change the input type of the bump map to tangent space normal, as we're using a normal map. Finally, I dragged in the roughness map and plugged this into the reflection roughness of our gold material. Now our label looks really matte, so we need to add a ramp node and recolor this roughness map. Press Shift C to bring up your node menu, and we'll grab a ramp node and then plug the texture into this and plug the ramp into the reflection roughness. Let's output the ramp texture to our surface just so that we can preview it easier. Let's darken this image, which will then increase the glossiness of our gold material. We can do this by dragging our sliders inwards to increase contrast and then reducing the white value to a grey. Let's output our material blender and have a look at it now. This looks much better. Let's move on to the texturing of the bottle, where we will start to add embossings, which will really help to add realism to our render. Let's move to Adobe Illustrator, where we will use our reference image and start detailing our bottle. Let's put this in a template layer, which will lock it and fade it slightly. And now we're going to recreate these embossing details from the spec sheet. Let's start with creating those dots. Let's grab the ellipse tool and then let's make a circle and line it up with the circles on the reference image. Let's rotate these around an axis. Press R for the rotate tool, and if we hold Alt/Command, we'll see 3 dots appear. Left click and we'll get this rotate menu pop up. We can now type 360 followed with a / and then the amount of circles we want to create, then hit copy. Now we can press Ctrl D, which will continue to duplicate our object based on the amount of times we set around that 360-degree angle. Unless you want to count up exactly how many circles there are, it may be a bit of trial and error until you get the right amount. Let's repeat this same process with the outer circles. For the text in the center, we can create a circle and use the type along path tool to create our curved text. For the rest of the icons, I just use the circle, rectangle, and pen tool to create them. Pretty simple stuff. Let's scale this up so when we paste it into Photoshop, it's nice and high res. To ensure strokes scale properly, go to Window, Transform, and enable Scale Strokes and Effects. Let's scale this up, and I'm also going to duplicate it and make the next one editable. So let's go to Object, Expand, and this will just make sure that when we paste it into Photoshop, it gets pasted correctly. Let's paste this into Photoshop using the Layers mode and position it into the correct area of the map. I'll then tidy up our layers by grouping them and converting them to smart objects, ready for when we create our bump maps. Then we'll move on to setting up the details which you see at the base of a bottle, such as production numbers and those little bumps. We'll convert these to smart objects and change them to white, ready to blur and turn into a bump map. We'll do the same for the rest of the details. To export this for Cinema 4D, let's create a new layer and fill it with black, and now we can export this as a PNG. Back in Cinema 4D, let's start building our bottle material. We'll create a new Redshift material and drag this onto our bottle. Let's brighten our diffuse slightly and then start applying our bump material. Remember to set the color space to raw. Let's link this into our bump map and then into our material. I'll decrease the height scale to 0.01. Let's press play in the Redshift render view to check it out. And voila, we can see the embossings coming through. The bumps on the bottle currently feel too soft, so let's jump back to Photoshop and reduce the blur. This feels better. Let's move on to creating the embossings for the rest of the bottle. I wanted to create stripes down the bottle, so I had this idea of using a rectangle with a repeated black to white gradient, but it didn't quite give me the look I wanted, so let's just zoom past that and use a different method. Here we are in Photoshop with our failed attempt, but let's start from scratch and create a rectangular selection and fill it with white. Let's convert this to a smart object, double click the layer to open up the layer style and add a gradient overlay. Let's set this to a simple black to white gradient and set the style to be reflected. Let's change the black to a grey colour, which will make the fall off of our bump much smoother in Cinema. Hold Alt whilst you drag it to duplicate our rectangle until we duplicate and fill that whole UV map. Let's select all the layers and press Ctrl T for transform and then scale these down so they're not as wide. We'll then Alt drag these again to duplicate and fill the rest of the map. Press Ctrl G to group all these layers and then right click and convert to Smart Object. Let's enable our black background. We'll then create a layer mask which we'll use to fade out the top and bottom of our stripes. Remember, setting the brush color to black will mask out and white will mask back in. You can use the shortcut X to quickly swap between your foreground and background colors. We'll then add a subtle blur to our stripes so that the edges of each stripe aren't so harsh. Okay, this looks good. Let's export it as a PNG. We're going to blend this bump map with the one we made earlier, so we need to create a bump blender. Hit Shift C to bring up your node menu, and then let's grab a bump blender. Let's control drag our current texture and bump map node to duplicate it, and then let's load the new embossings into that image texture. Let's plug the new bump map into the input of the bump blender, and then output the bump blender into the bump input of the material. This is looking good, but let's increase the bump amount to 0.1 just to make this more prominent. Let's now link the other bump map into the bump blender by plugging it into bump input 0 and then increasing the bump weight all the way up to 1. Now it's hiding our other bump map, so in order to be able to see both of them, we just need to enable additive mode. Let's fine tune the embossing around the label so that it feels a bit more bespoke. Let's switch to UV edit mode to find the polygons where the label is. We'll then head to Photoshop to mask this area out. Now we're in Photoshop and we just need to find the same area and mask it out from the stripes. Let's put the stripes into a group and create a layer mask, which we can then use to mask out this label area. We'll create a rectangular selection and fill it with black to mask it out. Now we just need to readjust the stripes so that they line up with both edges of the empty area where the label is going to be. This is a really small detail, but it will really help to add to the realism of the final render. Also, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I literally couldn't continue without getting this bit done. Let's put this into another group with another layer mask, which we'll then use to soften the edges of the label area. We'll use a soft brush to fade away these edges until we get a result we're happy with. We'll export this for Cinema 4D and refresh the render view to see how it's looking. At this stage, it's a case of going back and forth between Photoshop and Cinema, making tweaks until we get it into a place we're happy with. This looks pretty good to me. Now let's finish this off by texturing the lid. I feel like we've covered all the principles for how I texture using Illustrator, Photoshop and Cinema, so I'm going to zoom through this part. Let's give this lid a wooden finish. We'll go to our best friend, aka CCOtextures.com, and grab a wood texture. Wood 052 looks good to me. Let's load in the color, normal and roughness maps. We'll output the color texture to the surface and then solo out the lid so we can see how it looks by itself. I want the neck of the lid to display the wood texture vertically, so let's go into the UV edit mode and rotate our UVs. Jump into polygon mode and select the neck using loop selection. Remember UL for shortcut. We'll then move into the UV editor and press R for rotate. Hold shift to rotate incrementally and rotate at 90 degrees. Press E for the move tool and move the UV island so it isn't overlapping anything else. Let's go back to the startup layout and refresh the render view. Beautiful. Let's edit the color of this wood slightly. Drop down a color correction node. But first, don't forget your color spaces. Set it to raw for normal and roughness maps and sRGB for the color texture. Okay, let's plug our color texture into the color correct node and then output that to the surface so we can preview it. Let's increase the brightness and reduce the saturation slightly. Let's pump some of that color back in. We'll wire this into the material base color and then output the material to the surface. Looking good. To finish this off, let's plug in the normal map and play with a roughness map to add some additional detail. I also tweaked with the bump of the text to make the embossing feel more natural. Let's disable solo mode so we can see the whole bottle. Okay, it's the final push now. Let's update this clay material to glass and then get our liquid in there. Let's select our bottle material and choose glass from the preset menu. Let's create our liquid. Create a new material and drag it onto our liquid model. Using the lovely preset menu again, let's select water. This is just a placeholder for now, but we'll come back later and refine this and change the liquid color. Let's grab a dome light and load in a HDRI. I'm just using an abstract HDRI, which gives us some nice and quite interesting results. Now we're working with something. Let's rotate our dome light and see what different results we can get. This is looking good for now. Those glass details are bossing. Shoo! As a last minute change, I decided to change the lid from wood to gold to match the texture of the label. For everyone always asking my render settings, this moment's for you. Let's dive into the settings and bring out some more detail in our glass. Switch our settings mode to advanced and go to the globals tab. Then bump up the refraction to 6 and the combined depth to 12. And straight away we can see more detail in the refraction of our glass. Shoo! If we wanted to, we could also tint the color of the glass. Just dive into the refraction color and add some hue and saturation. You can also add a similar shade in the transmittance color so that the tint becomes more saturated within the object. Let's leave this on a bluish tint for now and let's dive into the lighting. In this section, we'll look at adding additional lights in order to bring more detail into our bottle. Let's start by adding area lights to introduce highlights to the front of our bottle. We'll add a target tag to our area light and then drag our bottle label into the target object. Let's lock our render view to the current camera so we can jump out of the camera in the viewport and start moving the light around. The key here is to use these area lights to help give some shape to the bottle. In this case, we can do this by placing an area light to the left and right of the bottle to help accentuate the curves. At the moment, this area light looks too harsh, so let's introduce a gradient texture to give it a soft fall off. I'm using a gradient texture from Grayscale Gorilla, but you can make your own if you want. Straight away we can see the fall off that this texture provides, but we want it to fade towards the center instead of the bottom, so let's rotate this light. This looks much better now. Let's scale it up and move it more to the left so that it really hits the side of the bottle. It feels a bit bright at the moment and it's taken away from the color of the glass, so let's drop the exposure slightly. This feels more natural, and now we can do the same for the other side. Control and drag your area light to duplicate it. We need to rotate the area light again so that it fades towards the center. Let's play with the position and exposure of this light so we get a nice highlight to fill the right hand side of the bottle. If we change the mode to color and temperature, we can tint our light while still using the gradient texture. Playing with warmer and cooler temperatures can add some more depth to your lighting and help to blend it in with your object more. I still feel like both of the area lights are slightly overexposed, so let's just drop down the intensity slightly. We'll create one more area light to highlight the label and make it stand out. Control drag your light to duplicate it. We'll scale this light down and move it more towards the center and disable all the other lights so we can focus on this one for now. Let's swap this out for a reflected gradient texture so that it fades out on both sides. Let's increase the height of the light so that we can catch some more reflection on the rest of the bottle. The gold label feels quite matte now, so let's edit our roughness map to make it more glossy. We can do this by dropping the white value down to a grey, and now we have more glossiness in our label. This label light feels quite overexposed, so let's drop down the exposure slightly. Let's finalize the glass and liquid materials and then also experiment with some different lighting options. Let's open up our glass material and change the refraction color to white. We'll also do the same for the transmittance color. Next, onto the liquid. Let's change the refraction color to a warm orange to reflect the color of rum. To add some more variation, we'll add a warmer tone to the transmittance color and change the absorption scale to 0.05 so more of a warm color is absorbed. This looks good to me. Shoo! Now we can play with different HDRIs and rotations to give us completely different results to our liquid. For renders like this, I tend to use blurred, abstract HDRIs to give the liquid some interesting variation. I quite liked the result I got from using a simple spotlight HDRI and increasing the exposure slightly to make the liquid have a subtle glow to it. It's worth noting that in order for the liquid to appear, you do need to have the background of your HDRI enabled. If it's disabled, the liquid will disappear as the environment illuminating it isn't actually visible. This does mean that if you wanted to render this out without a background, you'll have to set up some AOVs such as a crypto matte or puzzle matte to then mask it out in post-production. Luckily, this is something we're going to go over later on in the video. Taking everything we've learnt so far, let's create a scene using our bottle, which we will then render and edit in After Effects. Most of the scene setup is fairly straightforward, so I will speed up some of it and then talk through the key parts. Also, check out my Gumroad for the glass model. To start off, I'm experimenting with compositions which I think work well. For this scene, I'm using two objects, a cube for the floor and a plane for the back wall, so it's pretty simple. I started lighting the scene using a redshift sun and sky object because I wanted to go for quite a daylight, sunny feel to the piece. I updated the small glass to be clear and then filled it with the same liquid material as the rum bottle. I then continued to play with the layout of the bottle and the glass, and I wanted the bottle to be the hero of the piece, so I bring it closer to the foreground. I experimented with removing the wall to create a very clean background, but I felt it lacked some depth. To increase the softness of the sun, go to the sun tab and increase the sun disk scale. I increased it to 5 just to add a subtle blur to the shadows. I then created a material for the floor. All I did was change the diffuse color to blue, as I felt like this would contrast well with the orange color of the rum. Using the same principles from earlier, I created some area lights to highlight the left and right hand side of the bottle. This is to make the bottle stand out from the background and to make it feel more of the hero of the shot. I decided to bring the wall back into the shot, which I think makes the layout feel more interesting. I want this piece to feel more dramatic, so I decided to experiment with an area light instead of using the sun and sky object. As always, I apply a target tag to my area light and use the bottle as the target object. I move the light around so it's hitting the object from the left, and I turn down the spread to make the light sharper. I position the light in a way which puts the bottle in the spotlight whilst keeping some of the background in the shadows. This helps to separate the foreground and the background and bring more focus to the bottle. I bring the glass back in frame so there is another object to balance out out of composition, and I then rejig both objects until I'm happy with their placement. I then continue to tweak the lighting ever so slightly and re-enable the liquid in the glass. In real life, these objects would cast caustics, so let's enable this in the Details tab of our area light. I also made sure to add a redshift object tag and enable cast caustic photons on my bottle and glass. We need to enable bucket rendering to see our caustics, so let's do that and check the result. This is looking way too noisy, which means we need to increase the amount of photons being casted by our light, but first I want to address our area light, which is being used to cast highlights onto our bottle. Let's increase the height of the light so that the reflection catches more of the bottle, and then move it more to the left so it acts as more of a rim light. Okay, let's revisit the caustics light and bump those photons way up. Let's try 10 million. I slightly reposition the area light so the shadows are being casted closer to the camera. We then need to add a fill light for the black area in the bottom right corner. For this I use an area light with a gradient texture, which gives us a good hit of contrast in the corner. Let's do another bucket render to see how it looks with the increased amount of caustic photons. This is looking much better, but I do feel like the label is getting lost. Let's create another area light and move it around to the front so that it lights up the label. Before wrapping this scene up and moving on to rendering, I make some final tweaks to the lighting, such as scaling down our key light to make it sharper, and also disabling a dome light which I didn't realise I had enabled in the scene. This added some more contrast and just gave the scene a bit more of a feel and a mood to it. Let's do one last bucket render to check everything over, and then we will set up the render settings for it to be exported and edited in After Effects. Because I may need to adjust different areas of this render in post-production, let's set up some AOVs. These are some of the most common AOVs and the ones that we will need for this render. Simply drag and drop them from the list. Cryptomats and refractions will be particularly important. Let's dive into some of these settings and get ready to export. First, let's make sure the format is set to OpenEXR. 16-bit will be fine for this. Then choose your output location. I also like to disable multi-layer files so I have separate files for my AOVs. I'll lock the aspect ratio and then double the size of the output so it's higher res. Since this is just a still image and the render times won't be too crazy, I'll leave it on automatic sampling. As I'll be converting to ACES and After Effects, let's change our view type to raw and uncheck compensate for view transform. This will give us much more flexibility in After Effects when it comes to color correction. Everything else looks good to me, so let's hit that render button. In the next and final stage of this workflow, we will look at how we can use post-production to take this render to the next level. We're in After Effects, let's import our EXR files from our render. Let's drag the beauty paths into a new composition. Press Ctrl-Shift-Y to create an adjustment layer and then search for ColorIO in the Effects and Presets panel. You'll need to download this effect from this website if you don't have it already. Select Configuration and then Custom, search for your .OCIO file. Again, if you've never installed this before, you can find it online. I'll drop it in the description down below. Let's change the input space to ACES CG and the output space to sRGB. Now let's apply one more effect called Color Profile Converter. Change both the input profile and output profile to sRGB, but under Output Profile, enable Linearize Output Profile. You should now see the ACES result we had in Cinema 4D. If you're not seeing the same result, go to File, Project Settings, Color, make sure you're using 32 bits, make sure your working space is sRGB, and then make sure Linearize working space is enabled. It's worth noting this ACES conversion should be the very top layer, except for some effects which we'll discuss later. Let's start by bringing in our Cryptomat AOV, arguably one of the most powerful AOVs we'll use. By default we won't see anything, but we can fix that by applying an effect called Cryptomat. Now we have a color ID for every object in our scene. Whilst having the Cryptomat effect selected, we can simply click in the viewport to isolate different masks. Hold Shift and you can continue to add to your selection. We can then change the output to matte only to create a black and white mask from our selection. Let's drag in our specular AOV and use this Cryptomat to mask it out. Simply select Luma Matte Inverted on our specular lighting layer, which will mask it only to black areas of our Cryptomat layer. Now we have hidden our liquid, so let's bring in our refraction pass. Let's change it to linear dodge to overlay this layer. We're nearly back to where we started, let's just bring in our reflections pass and we should be there. If we compare this with the original, we should now have the same result. The beauty of this is that now we have control over each aspect of this render separately. This is where the magic really happens. Currently the liquid doesn't look very interesting, but this is where we can use the power of compositing to take it to the next level. First we need to hop back to Cinema 4D. What we're going to do here is render additional passes for just the liquid. You can see I've set up multiple dome lights with different HDRIs at different angles, causing the refractions to create different results and therefore create additional renders for the liquid. For this to work best, I would disable all other objects and lights in the scene, so we're purely just getting refractions from our dome lights. The first one, for example, is giving us a nice glow at the bottom of our bottle, something which was lacking before. I encourage you to play with your HDRIs and see how it reacts to your bottle and liquid. you may get some really interesting results. Now it's a case of stacking as many different light setups as you'd like and then rendering each one out separately. In total, I made 4 additional light setups, which we will now export and add in After Effects. For these renders, all we need are the refraction passes, so we can disable the other AOVs for now. Remember to set up your color space properly, as we are doing the ACES conversion in After Effects. I've already got these rendered out, so let's hop back to After Effects. Let's drag in our first additional refraction pass. We'll set this to linear dodge and watch the magic happen. Beautiful, look at the difference. Okay, let's keep stacking these and see the result that we get. For the last one, I'll bring up the opacity menu by pressing T and reducing this to 25%. We can see a huge difference in our render from having those additional passes, and now it feels like a professional product shot. Now let's dive into some color correction. This comes down to personal preference, but I will run through some of the tools that I use for my renders. Let's grab a hue and saturation effect and apply this to our new adjustment layer. We'll use this to shift the liquid to a slightly warmer tone. It's a subtle difference, but these details really do add up. Let's grab another effect called Lumetri Color, and this is where we'll do the most of our color correction. This is a really powerful color correction effect, and it really depends on your render, but you can use this to push and pull highlights, shadows, adjust toning, and apply color correction presets. I've used it here to pump some more contrast into the scene, as well as increase the saturation of the blues. Next, I want to tackle the floor, as it feels quite overexposed and is distracting from the bottle. Let's grab another adjustment layer and use our crypto matte to mask it to the floor. We can press Ctrl D to duplicate our previous crypto matte layer and then press reset to get all our masks back. We'll then set our adjustment layer to Luma Matte so it only applies to the floor. Let's grab a levels adjustment and start tweaking with the settings to even out the lighting of this floor. This looks better already. Although we have lost some color and contrast, let's add a curves and a hue and saturation to bring some of that back in. This looks so much better and definitely helps to make the glass and bottle stand out. Let's add another adjustment layer, this time with a hue and saturation to adjust the blues in the image. The floor has some more colour to it now, helping to furthermore create that contrast between the orange and blue. A couple more tweaks left. Let's make another adjustment layer, this time using a crypto matte to mask it to the floor and wall. We're going to use an effect called selective colour for this adjustment layer. Notice how it was a warning sign next to it. This means that it only works on 8/16-bit projects, so we have to drag it above the ACES layer, otherwise it won't display properly. Selective colour can be used to tint and adjust specific colours, so we're using it to brighten the floor and wall, whilst keeping them saturated. This adjustment makes the blue tones feel a bit more natural and complement the orange tones better. We can see from the before and after how we also lifted the black so it doesn't feel as dark. Let's duplicate this adjustment layer and crypto matte, but this time set the adjustment layer to Luma Invert Matte so it only affects the bottle and glass. We'll then reset the selective colour and this time just edit the black tones. This is really powerful because we can use this to recolor shadows, and in this case use it to recolor the liquid and eliminate any dark patches. We can see how we've used this to create more contrast whilst injecting some warm tones into the shadows. Let's create one final adjustment layer and then I think we'll be done. Let's add an effect called Noise HLS. This is a great effect for creating grain because it bases the noise off hue, lightness, and saturation, so you can really fine tune the look of it. I find using some grain helps to add realism to the render, as it mimics the noise you would get in a photograph taken by a DSLR camera. Let's look at the original render we started with. What we have created using post-production techniques is worlds apart from this render that we're seeing here. The before and after truly feels like night and day. The result we have been able to create using some additional passes is truly something special, and I hope if you take anything away from this video, it's just how powerful post-production can be. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button, and thank you for watching.